Japan is a very old country. In fact, one could argue that it is technically the oldest country in the world if you use the definition in its most literal and traditional sense, that being a nation with its own government occupying a particular territory. While Japan has had many different types of government throughout the centuries, it has had the same head of state, that being the incumbent on the chrysanthemum throne, known as the Emperor of Japan. It is the oldest monarchy in the world, stretching all the way back to 660 BC, and has a culture that goes back still further. Their language, their art, and their traditions have roots in practices dating back thousands of years. From their encounters with China and the development of their own writing, to the turbulent years of the Second World War which shook the nation to its very core. Despite it all, Japan has always had a strange sense of immortal continuity in both its society and its culture. And it is a wonderful culture at that. Strap yourselves in, guys, because this is going to be a long one, and it's going to take a lot of background. So, get yourselves ready for Crash Course Japanese World History without annoying Ivy League liberals. Let's go. Ever since I was a very little kid, I've always had a fascination with Japan and its history. I watched World War II documentaries with Dad, and I always loved the parts when it talked about Japan. My favourite was a series called Clash of Wings, where Japanese ace Saburo Sakai talked about his exploits flying the Japanese Zero fighter. But this was not my first introduction I had to Japan. You see, I learnt to speed read at a very young age by reading subtitles. Those being Japanese subtitles. But it wasn't anime I was watching. No. My first introduction to Japan was around age 3, when I first saw this. Gamera, Guardian of the Universe. Alright, can you just imagine for a second what this is like for a 3-year-old? This movie was the absolute shit. It was scary in some parts, action-packed in others. It's a 60-meter tall giant turtle that can fly through space, dogfighting giant dinosaur birds that shoot fucking lasers. Also, this turtle happens to spin like a UFO and shoots fireballs. To 3-year-old Pac-Man, it was like a door had been opened. What the hell is this, and why is it so cool? And are there other movies like this? Yes, ladies and gents, from the tender age of 3, I was a kaiju fan. I know it sounds funny me saying that Gamera and Godzilla taught me how to read, but I swear to God it was true. I used to scan the TV guide, and whenever I saw Gamera or Godzilla on Australia's foreign film channel, that being SBS, I would immediately run and find Dad and beg. Hands and knees shit, okay? I would beg to record them. I still have one of the original VHS tapes to this day, and an original VHS store-bought which I got on Christmas 1999. The very first proper kaiju film. The one and only Godzilla, King of the Monsters. And of course, as time moved on, I got a Game Boy, which came with Pokemon Red, and eventually a PS2 with the game Godzilla Save the Earth, released for the 50th anniversary of Godzilla in 2004. Point is, growing up, I really couldn't avoid Japanese media and culture. It was literally everywhere in my life. From the cartoons I watched before school, those being Dragon Ball, Pokemon, and Yu-Gi-Oh!, to my kaiju movies and the games I played, Japan was a country I was drawn to. And as I got older, I learned more and more about the country's history and culture, and I began to fall ever more in love with it. Shogun Total Wars, the games, 1 and 2, introduced me to the Sengoku Jidai, while films like The Last Samurai showed me the modernization of Japan and the latter part of the 19th century. And of course, you have the most amazing films, Tora 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 and Letters from Iwo Jima, depicting 2 of the most iconic moments in the Pacific War from a Japanese perspective. Something that, to be honest, back then and today is still very rarely seen in popular media. But as I got older and eventually found anime, the medium which we all love and cherish so much, I had started to read actual histories and learned the real truths behind all the movies and games I had grown up loving. All the little nuances in culture and conversation that you pick up while watching Japanese films, whether live action or anime, they begin to give you an impression of life in Japan, even if it is dramatized or hammed up. They all tackle particular issues or cover particular popular situations, and as such, the idiosyncrasies of Japanese social interactions began to stand out. And what I began to discover painted a darker picture than the bright radiance of its culture would suggest. Japan's history and culture have a murkier side to it, one which casts a shadow over Japan today and over much of the Central and Southern Pacific. Throughout its history, Japan has always had the most bizarre of paradigms as a culture and as a country. As a culture, it has a history of rapid modernization. Their alphabet and government was based almost entirely on that of China's. Their first contact with Europeans, meanwhile, spurred a frenzy to purchase books and equipment from the gaijin, outsiders. leading to the mass adoption of firearms in the armies of the Sengoku period, as well as massive advances in the sciences and medicine. But what really forged Japan into the nation it became in the modern era can be traced back to the reign of the Tokugawa Shogunate. After the failed attempt to conquer Korea and Manchuria by one shogun named Toyotomi Hideyoshi, Tokugawa Ieyasu seized the moment and used his neutrality in that war as a weapon. Tokugawa had been given immunity from participating in wars due to his loyal service to Toyotomi, and as such his army was still completely intact. With all the other lords having sent troops to Korea, Tokugawa used his full force to dominate Japan and establish himself as shogun. He passed 2 decrees which would forever change the country. First, Japan would be closed to foreigners entirely, except for one port in Kyushu open to the Portuguese. But the other decree was far more damaging. Social mobility in Japan was to be frozen permanently. Whatever class you were when the Tokugawa Shogunate took over, that would be your family's place in society forever. And it is here we find the opposite end of the paradigm. For while Japan to this day always likes to stay on the cutting edge technologically, socially and culturally, it is the complete opposite. This period of isolation left Japan practically cut off from the rest of the world during its most turbulent cultural shifts. The age of the trade empires, endless wars, the colonization of the Americas and Australia, the Enlightenment and cultural exchanges provided by immigration and trade between states, as well as the sharing of knowledge and goods inside those states. And then, of course, the revolutionary waves in the United States, France, and China. All of these different, incredibly important developments were completely lost on Japan. The country essentially froze in time. So when in 1853 the United States Navy sailed into Tokyo Bay, it found a land that was essentially 250 years behind in development, and thus the United States forced them to comply with all their demands of opening trade. American military might and its premium export, weapons, drove the then daimyo of the Shimazu clan in Kyushu to make a prophetic statement. If we take the initiative now, we can dominate. If we do not, it is we who will be dominated. And thus, Japan modernized and fast. The Meiji Restoration is a complex historical topic, but the short version is that Japan achieved 250 years of technological and industrial development in the span of 30 years. Culturally, however, Japan remained a feudal society, and the reforms that were made, i.e. the abolition of the samurai class, only gave way to a new type of aristocracy, that being the zaibatsu. For you see, they had learned another trick from the West: capitalism. And like everything Japan adopts, they take its efficiency and its limits to a whole new fucking level, to the extent that the samurai class had either perished, been wiped out, or they morphed into corporate overlords. In any case, the social strata remained the same in Japan. If you weren't wealthy, nobility, or highly educated, you were a peasant, subservient to your betters. And while on the surface it looks like some progress has been made, to this day Japan has one overriding social stigma. One cultural trait that dates all the way back to the beginning, and it is summed up in one simple phrase: know your place. And it is here where the video really starts. The personal background of myself and my experiences with Japan, and of course the history lesson, were necessary to give you guys some context to the contemporary issues that Japan faces, because I'm going to cover the current social issues in detail that are taking place in Japan, and I will explain how I believe art, and crucially anime, will save Japan. Japan's Prime Minister Shinzo Abe and the current Japanese government are very conservative. In fact, the Japanese culture in its modern shape is one of the most conservative in the developed world. I would go as far to say that only the Middle Eastern theocracies like Saudi Arabia have a more socially and culturally conservative society in the developed world, and this is directly reflected in the history of the country, from its feudal origins and ruthless class system to its immediate jump into the modern world without any adjustment to modern technologies or cultural sensibilities. The rise of Imperial Japan and the following wars of expansion, such as the Russo-Japanese War and the Sino-Japanese War, are direct reflections of this. Kraut made a great video about the Japanese cultural upheavals of this time, which you should definitely go and watch. Anyway, due to its isolation and policy of executing gaijin, Japan was left void of any major foreign immigration or cultural influences until 1853, and even then, immigration was very, very low, and as such, it is a largely monoethnic and monotheistic society. This came to a head during the early 20th century when the Great Clash and global rise of nationalism saw Japan's military and ruling establishment recall its glory days in the latter stages of the Sengoku period, idolizing both Bushido and the emperor. leading to the inevitable expansionism and calamitous wars which would ultimately end in Japan being razed to the ground. The devastation wrought by World War II, of course, did nothing to encourage immigration, and so to this day Japan remains almost entirely Japanese in its ethnic makeup. Gaijin are still regarded with the same mixture of politeness, curiosity, and suspicion. Among the older generations, this is true at least. Koreans and Chinese, meanwhile, despite recent political efforts, are often subjected to racial abuse and violence, often being blamed for rising crime and unemployment, picking on an ethnic minority in order to secure your own solidified power base. Sound familiar? Anyway, this has been exacerbated by a very powerful interest group, Nippon Kaigi, basically the Japanese equivalent of the Tea Party, of which Shinzo Abe is a member. They promote denial of Japanese war crimes, the restoration of Japan's armed forces into an offensive-capable force, and most prominently of all, the restoration of the Empire of Japan as an institution, with a focus on conservative values of patriarchal dominance in the workplace and political process. Family values, meanwhile, are enshrined, with women as in a subservient childbearing and homemaking capacity, and cracking down on any progressive elements through a police state. Most notably, the LGBT community and racial justice groups protesting the treatment of Chinese and Korean immigrants. Japan's legal system, meanwhile, is ferociously draconian. Japan has a 99% conviction rate in its judicial system because in Japan, the burden of proof is not on the state, rather it is on the defendant. After all, the government serving in the name of the emperor, and by extension the Japanese nation and people, could never make a mistake. And of course, people who are accused of a crime are not tried by a jury of their peers, but by a panel of judges who are usually, guess what, state employees. And if arrested, suspects are interrogated for up to 23 days with very limited access to defense counsel, and almost no controls are in place regarding the police. Almost all convictions are secured before trial due to the suspect confessing. And if imprisoned, the treatment of inmates is best described as rehabilitation by enslavement. They are forbidden to speak for most of the day, they are kept in isolated conditions and worked relentlessly. Their return to society is permitted when they have not only accepted their guilt, but embraced it. It is their duty to society to return to work, if someone will hire them, and live out their lives with the knowledge that they bring dishonor onto their family and onto themselves. Crime rates in Japan are some of the lowest in the world, not because the causes of crime are not present, and not because the punishment is too draconian. On the contrary, it's far more insidious than that. There is low crime in Japan because the very concept of breaking the law is almost foreign to most Japanese. Theft is non-existent. In fact, there was an instance where a major Tokyo train station asked the public to stop returning so many lost items to the lost and found because they had no room to store them. You might say this sounds utopian, but the truth is it's a symptom of the opposite. It represents a society and culture so repressed that speaking out or going against the grain, even at the cost of your own life in extreme cases, is so taboo, so ingrained as an anathema that in many cases it doesn't even occur to people that dissent is an option. And this level of repression is rife throughout all aspects of Japanese society. The honorifics for which the Japanese language is famous are a prime example of the hierarchy-based structure in which they live. But the workplace is where it's most prevalent. Joey, the anime man, a fellow countryman of mine from this great nation of Australia, described the phenomenon of the Japanese work ethic. What amounts to indentured servitude and unhealthily long hours are common in Japan. The example he cites specifically is the fact that it is considered inappropriate for a subordinate to leave before their superior leaves the workplace. And this goes from the top all the way on down. So if the CEO has a late night, guess what? Everyone does. Hierarchy is everything, and your position on the pecking order is reflected in literally all facets of your professional and even your personal life. How people address you, the honorifics they use to do so, what hours you work, where you can sit during a meeting, it is endless. In fact, the work culture is so toxic in Japan that retirement is one of the leading causes of elderly suicide. Not being able to work stretches their finances and, in their view, robs the elderly of meaningful life, to the extent that one of the first uses of a publicly available, marketable exoskeleton was by elderly Japanese so they could continue performing hard physical labor. Meanwhile, it is considered noble that you should sleep on the job. Now, you think that sounds contradictory to everything I've just said, until you get the crucial bit of context that sleeping on the job is only permitted either if you are of senior rank, that's right, rank has its privileges, and you are catching a nap in between meetings, or it's after you've completed your 16-hour day and you're catching a nap at your desk before getting back to work tomorrow morning without having gone home. It's a sign of honor and dedication that you literally do not go home. Even in our own beloved anime industry, in fact, especially in our own beloved anime industry, it's chronic. Animators are known to sleep under their desks in between work sessions. Animators are paid by the frame completed, while artists, general artists, are routinely underpaid and overworked, leading to horrific crunch time. And to top it all off, unions in Japan have been in constant decline, except for the automotive industry. Why the automotive industry, you ask? Simple. Because when unions were starting to form in Japan, the automotive industry got around this problem by founding the unions themselves. Toyota, Nissan, all the major automotive companies formed their own in-house unions to pacify the workforce. Basically, it was a system where you could register with the internal union and then raise your complaints to management. And it worked. The employees backed it up, conceded. They conceded on multiple points and then went back to work. Could you imagine Walmart forming its own union and everyone completely accepting it as legit? Yep, Walmart formed a union for its employees to join. Let them join up, everything will be fine. The same company that held a charity drive for its own workers. Do you reckon people would buy it? I don't think so. And this work ethic is slammed into people from the day they are born. From my experiences in meeting and interacting with Japanese exchange students, as well as their depictions in media, both live action and anime, as well as documentaries on the subject, I was struck by the absolute brutality of the Japanese education system. The almost military-like discipline of the students I met was astonishing. The culture shock for them in seeing how they interacted with our teachers was equally surprising, I'm sure, and it was kind of hilarious to watch, to be honest. Social pressure in Japan is huge. The repression and ostracization of nonconformists is rampant, and by extension, bullying in Japan is incredibly ferocious. Furthermore, the demands of Japanese society of its students could be considered borderline brainwashing. While this seems endemic across most Asian cultures, performance pressure in Japan in both the professional space as well as student spaces, all the way from elementary school to college, is genuinely insane. And rather tragically, this can be seen in its quite high youth suicide rates, which have been trending upwards in recent years, with both students and young workers taking their lives due to stress, overwork, bullying, and in the case of older generations, financial issues. In fact, a recent study was released, I think it was in 2016, I'm not sure, don't quote me on this, where the leading cause of death between the ages of 10 and 21 among men was suicide. It beat out fatal diseases, car accidents, everything. The leading cause of death was suicide. Think about that for a sec. Anyway, let's get on to the big issue. The largest issue, which I referenced at the beginning of this segment. The hyper-traditionalist nature of Japanese society and its treatment of women. Women in Japan are subjected to some of the most discriminatory treatment in the developed world. They are treated as lesser than men in almost every professional setting, including the ones which are female-dominated. The music and modelling industry is of course the worst offender, as it is in the West, but it is truly devastating to see how badly professional women are treated. The most recent scandal is of course the one that went global and viral on the internet, in which Japanese women working in a professional capacity were asked not to wear glasses that are required. These glasses are required to correct their vision, as it made them look cold and intimidating to clients and customers. Women are expected to carry out their domestic duties first and foremost, often advised to keep out of the working world after marriage. However, degrading economic conditions have softened this somewhat. But the most telling example I could find pertaining to this subject of how Japan views its women is again courtesy of the Anime Man, when he interviewed Japanese adult actress Shibuya Kahu. She contrasted the Japanese adult industry with the male-dominated industries of standard business and the Western adult industry. Shibuya-san described the fact that in Japan, standard businesses are very structured and you must work your way from the bottom all the way up. In the West, this is exactly the same, including in the adult industry. Western adult actresses like Sasha Grey, Mia Khalifa, Jenna Jameson, etc. gain popularity because of their skill and their fame, which results in their paycheck getting larger as they are more in demand. Because of course they're more popular, they're bringing in the views, so they are paid more for their work. In Japan, meanwhile, it's the opposite.
Does the same thing kind of work in the JV industry?
Usually it's backwards.
Oh, okay.
Because debut is the big thing. I think Japanese people obsessed with how pure a girl is. Like,
Right.
Even in JB.
Yeah.
It's kind of weird, like,
確かに少女ものが一番売れますよね。
Their labor, their body, their very sexual identity is a commodity. And it's better to just replace it with a younger and newer model. Regardless of your views on sex work, to me, this is demeaning to a level that is frankly unacceptable and promotes the idea that women in Japan are essentially property. My former employer Telstra, I was working in a call center and I spoke to a Japanese lady, and I naturally spoke to her as much as I could about her culture and about her country and what she thought about Australia and why she was living here. She said that one of the biggest reasons that she married an Australian man and moved to Australia was to escape the treatment of women in Japan. Honest to God, that is what she said. And I know that's anecdotal. I can't put like a giant source in the bottom. This is just me telling a story. But as I said, I spoke to a Japanese woman who was a customer of the company I used to work for, and she told me that over the phone. She loved him, don't get me wrong. She didn't do it for the green card, but she fell in love with a foreigner because he treated her better than Japanese men did, and she then moved out to Australia so she could have a career and have a family, so she could escape the kind of treatment she was receiving in Japan as a woman. That should just give you an idea of, even though Japanese people are very reserved in how they don't like to talk about it very much, that should give you an idea. And given this, I don't think I really need to go into too much depth about LGBT issues, because you can probably guess how that goes given what still happens in the so-called liberal West. Suffice to say that despite its ever-growing normalization and some efforts by major cities such as Tokyo to protect them and protect their rights, homosexual relationships are not recognized under the law. They are forbidden to adopt children. There are no laws preventing hate crimes or discrimination against them, and coming out or being outed as gay can be socially as well as professionally apocalyptic. Given the aforementioned hyperconformist conservative culture with a propensity for bullying, you can predict the results for yourself. And again, LGBT suicide is very high in Japan. Very high. But there is hope. There is a gentle easterly breeze blowing from the streets of Kyoto, spreading the cherry blossoms of spring far and wide, all the way to the greater suburbs of Tokyo. It is a slowly gathering storm. This storm is the winds of change. And oh boy, the times they are a-changing. Whenever you look at a culture, your major barometer on its values and core ideals are always found in its art. It's why whenever you look at history, especially regards music or film, you can always identify what period it's from by the technology being used and the type of language and slang used or conveyed by the artist, and the core ideals and theories those terms represent. If you were to have a look at Western music, for example, you can see the clear divides in class between folk music and classical music, only for it to sort of morph into the calm and sophisticated era of lounge music and swing, personifying the boom periods of the turn of the century, which is then followed by the ever-growing struggle for expression by people of colour and colonised people with the explosion of jazz and soul music, which culminates in the titanic cultural shift of rock and roll in the 1960s, where ethnic and cultural lines began to merge and a rejection of the old cultural order began. And it goes on and on and on until we head into the modern era with alternative rock and rap music, giving voice to an alienated youth who feel that the new millennium is one of stagnation and the freedoms won at great cost by their ancestors are being thrown away. This is a long example, I know, but it gets my point across. This is true of Japan just as it is true of any culture. In fact, more so. The reason why Japanese popular culture is so explosive and different, in my view, is that such a repressed society needs to let all of its pent-up creative energy out in more extreme ways. And as the title of this video and of this script suggests, in my opinion, there is one place where the most avant-garde of Japanese art resides. A place where its popularity in other nations, its niche but dedicated audience, and its unique yet esoteric style give rise to radical expression far more easily than in music or live-action film, anime and manga. My theory is that given anime and manga is a niche market even in Japan, it has a more artistic freedom and a more circumspect audience. Its explosion in recent times and its public acceptance in Japan does of course make the core viewership far larger than in its early days, leading to many corporate inroads. There's no shortage of corporate copy and paste cash grab anime, let's be real here. But on the whole, it remains fairly independent from the other forms of media, by comparison anyway. The closest analogy to the West I have is science fiction, most notably Star Trek, in the sense that it's niche but also very popular at the same time, And because it's got a unique setting, which is distinct from reality, it's clearly not reality. It portrays a fictional universe, something that's very different. It allows the medium to tackle issues and raise questions that the mainstream media won't touch with a 10-foot pole. Like, they won't go near it in mainstream media, but this medium allows them to get at the heart of the issue. And so for every major issue I've brought up throughout this video, I have an anime which tackles it and tackles it hard. It cuts straight to the issue. Like I always do, I'm going to go through each issue in the sequence I originally addressed them, and cover the anime which I think addresses that topic most accurately. And if we are going to take on the insanely fierce conservatism that Japan has suffered for under many years, one show that explores the idea of paranoia and the control of society quite well is a show named Shinsekai Yori, From the New World. The show explores the dangers of a society that purposefully regresses or embraces stagnation in order to preserve the status quo, going so far as to kill children preemptively to prevent them from being a danger to society. With all of humanity being psychic, the children who aren't psychic, or in some cases are too psychic, are murdered to preserve a set order. They are conditioned from a young age to obey and be less aggressive, while being genetically modified to die should they try and kill another person. Any significant revolutionary change is hence impossible. But to ensure their security, they go even further. They intentionally manufacture a subhuman species known as monster rats, or queer rats, depending on translation, which they use as slave labour and an antagonist to justify not showing weakness. The only issue being that these queer rats or monster rats are a sentient species with a language and a culture and a society, eventually developing a democratic system which is in far contrast from the ruling council of the humans, which seems to be made up of executive appointees rather than elected officials. Not to mention that since the psychic awakening of humanity, there was a cataclysmic apocalypse, and the ruling council has taken every possible step to erase history to protect the youth from this knowledge. Divergence of any form is treated as a subversive threat. Art and education is tightly controlled, which draws some resentment. It is this fear of change and the iron grip of control that keeps society in order, and so they perpetuate it. It is only when it suffers a cataclysmic collapse that things change, but that is at a high cost indeed. One can see the disturbing parallels in how minorities are treated not just in Japan but in the world over. And given the iron grip the state has on censorship laws and its influence on the media, all the while trying to erase the crimes of its past, we see a grim mirror image on how Japan is today. Other Japanese authors and artists have touched on this sort of blind acceptance of the status quo. Kazuo Ishiguro's Never Let Me Go imagines a world of clones who are bred and raised from birth to be harvested for organs in order to keep the natural-born humans alive. It is such a horrifying concept, and the clones themselves are aware of their fate, but never once does it occur to them that resistance is a possibility. They simply accept it as their duty to society and carry it out. But in response to this sort of thinking, and the exacerbation of this thinking, anti-conformist art is on the rise in Japan, and as time goes on, it only gets more brazen. The most striking example of this I can think of would be Watanabe's Terror in Resonance. The very idea that there is a show directly depicting acts of terrorism as a morally justifiable act, while portraying the concept that the Japanese government is conducting operations and experiments not too different from those they conducted during the war years under Unit 731. Only instead of Germany, this time their collaborator is the United States, who enters into acts of imperialism and violates Japanese sovereignty in order to protect its own interests. The many years of conservative rule and the ever-degrading socio-economic situation globally is again starting to resemble the period prior to the Second World War. After all, you've got destabilization in Eastern Europe and Ukraine, you've got Catalonia in Spain threatening to trigger another Spanish civil war, you have an economic and political split between Europe and the United Kingdom. Things are looking a bit dire at the moment, guys. So much so that Donald Trump and Shinzo Abe were present at the naval review of the Japanese ship Kaga, Japan's true aircraft carrier since World War II. The Japanese Self-Defense Force is rapidly rearming, while the namesakes of all its ships lie at the bottom of the Pacific, having been sunk in the battles across the Pacific. The rise of nationalism, the call of conservative values and the reclaiming of lost glory is forever present, but the younger generations in Japan recognize these dangers for what they are. And with shows like Terror in Resonance and Shinsekai Yori, they are making it clear that they see what is happening and where it will lead if it's left unchecked. And this carries over to the discussion of Japan's justice and law enforcement systems. And of course, there is really only one show that stands far above all others in tackling this issue. That, of course, is the masterpiece that is Psycho Pass. Psycho Pass levies a very harsh criticism against the paradox of a seemingly utopian system by omnipotent law enforcement. The Sybil system has the ability to conduct a psychological scan and determine your propensity to commit a crime, regardless of whether you have committed a crime or are considering committing one. Sybil is the ultimate authority and it answers to no one. And even its inspectors and enforcers, the people who are sent out to enforce the law as part of the Public Safety Bureau, are trained not to question or even consider the details of the situation. Detectives are actively frowned upon and eventually labelled as latent criminals precisely because of the paradoxical system. Sybil can never be wrong because it is infallible, however it exists in a society populated by fallible beings and, spoiler alert, is powered by the brains of humans who by extension are also fallible. The Sybil system orders the execution of rape victims as a danger to society because they are so traumatized that they are considered potential psychological threats, for fuck's sake. This system is broken, but the confidence in the system, the belief in its infallibility is what maintains society, and by extension, the safety of the population. But the Sybil system cannot scan every person, and hence demonstrates that it is flawed, and it attempts to account for that by incorporating the non-conforming minds into its collective hive mind in an effort to create a perfect society. However, as Inspector Tsunemori points out, the system must judge itself, and if it did, it would realize that as a collective society, it can be judged, just as an individual can be, based on what it does and how it functions. Operating from a position of infallibility, while you yourself are fallible, but only able to survive based on your myth of infallibility, is a contradiction which will lead the system to destroy itself. The more you domesticate people, the more you shield them from harm, the more you attempt to force conformity, the more enemies you will create, and more frighteningly, the more susceptible to those enemies your own citizens are, as they will go to pieces once the facade is broken. The Japanese justice system operates from the position that it cannot be wrong, because if it admits fault, it by extension will admit a failure in the system. And this cannot be allowed because it will serve to undermine not only the structure itself, but the people operating in it. Ultimately, it becomes a case of serving its own interests and not that of the public. And as we see in Season 2 of Psycho Pass, this almost leads to the system's undoing. They only narrowly avoid it by reforming and refining their definitions and processes. But Inspector Akane Tsunemori shares prophetic wisdom which the Japanese state should take heed of. That in systems like these, one day the people will rise up and think for themselves. And the time will come when they have no need of you, and their justice will be more decisive than yours ever was. But the government is but a singular arm of a larger structural problem in modern society. The most all-encompassing and devastating force in modern Japan is that of oligarchic corporate capitalism, on a level we in the West only have a modicum of appreciation for. America is the home of capital, but if there was a nation who has perfected it, Japan would be it. The work culture and systems in place I discussed in the original part of this video are commonly referenced throughout anime of all genres, mainly because it's such an unmissable part of the Japanese landscape. Kobayashi from Dragon Maid, or more succinctly and hilariously, Retsuko from Agretsuko, both exhibit a clear sign of fatigue and stress from the pressures of the workplace. Both have unhealthy coping mechanisms as well. It's not a coincidence that most of the contemporary commentary on workplace practices in Japan are from a female perspective, but more on that later. Because right now I want to talk in this section not so much an anime, but a studio. The one which I never stopped loving and fanboying over. Kyoto Animation. There is a reason I said the wind of change was blowing from Kyoto. They are the first major anime studio to pay their entire staff a livable salary comparable to the work they do. And if you needed any proof that a happy and well-compensated workforce with a direct vested interest in their work is superior, just have a look at the shows they've produced. Haruhi, Lucky Star, K-On!, Nichijo, Hyoka, Full Metal Panic, Chunibyo, Clannad, Hibeke Euphonium, Violet Evergarden, and most beautifully of all, A Silent Voice. Kyoto Animation sets the standard for the most beautiful and inspiring works in anime, and I maintain that it is because they have a diverse staff from every demographic in Japan, who are paid well and take genuine pride in their work. This studio is a direct challenge to the corporate machine that tramples so many great artists under its feet. Even though it's not their show, I do feel them channeling the spirit of Ako Kagari. They proclaim loudly that we dare to be different, dare to be our own thing, and by the gods we are taking a stand. And even after the tragedy last year, they do what they always do. They make great anime and tell great stories, and they will forever stand proud in doing so. And before you ask, yes, that is a JoJo's reference. Because while I don't talk about JoJo in this video, I had to get one in here somewhere, because if nothing else, I am a man of culture. The endless struggle against the corporate machine, however, is not a unique theme in anime. In fact, my favourite anime of 2019, Carol and Tuesday, is the story of taking back music from an industry that views it as a mechanical profit-making venture, rather than the purest expression of the human soul. It also heavily deals with the discrimination and divides caused by class and race, which hit very close to home, if it's a bit ham-fisted and hand-wringing liberalism towards the end. But there are two other shows that I feel belong in this category more. The first is my favourite Battle Shonen series, which also happens to be the only ecchi show to ever hit #1 on streaming services, Shokugeki no Souma. The initial premise alone is about challenging the establishment, challenging the rich and powerful on their own ground, destroying preconceived notions and smashing unjustified hierarchies. Souma's struggle against the status quo and its ever-tightening grip around the food world is his mission. He is a diner cook, fighting in the big leagues, but he very quickly establishes that his experience on the front lines pushes him ahead of the sheltered, wealthy kids and the smug elites who feel themselves above others just by nature of their pedigree or their savant-like talent. However, this is just the beginning. When the show really kicks into high gear by season 3, Souma and his friends at the Polar Star Dorm are a unit, and they form a bulwark against Azami's hostile takeover. The entire premise of the show is a challenge to authority, a statement that there is no set order to things, that there is no truly rigid structure, and that holding on to a preconceived notion of class, convention, and of course the idea of how things should be is a guarantee not of preservation but of stagnation. Fun fact, Japan, despite its wealth, is the slowest growing economy in Asia. Food for thought. Their defense against Aizen, the corporate overlord of the Elite 10, is draped in symbolism, harkening back to the student movement of the 60s and 70s. Their white helmets and pressure hoses, backed up by their use of 2x4s as weapons. This portrayal is no accident. The anti-establishment and anti-corporate message of Food Wars is obvious to anyone who watches it. If you want to know more about this topic, there is a great film on the student movement of this period called The United Red Army by Koji Wakamatsu, which shows the radical challenge made to the establishment by student organizations at the time, culminating in extremist action groups. Souma wants all dishes to be free. No dish should be left unmade, no chef unacknowledged. A world where the skill of all chefs and the quality of their food is the only deciding factor on how they are judged, not by some arbitrary standard. And this world can only exist if big business and old power structures are swept away and replaced. Food Wars proclaims loudly that only an equal and just society, where everyone has a chance at the top, only a society where the inherent clash of ideas are able to flourish without conservative notions of how things should be. Only a society where fascists and tyrants are vanquished through revolt can truly produce the best of society and the best of humanity as a whole. Totsuki and Japan alike need to make way for fresh ideas, a new generation, a new direction, a new hope. Meanwhile, the other show on this topic is the complete opposite view of this world. A criticism rooted in its embodiment, the saga of Tanya the Evil. As the story goes, Tanya is a young girl who is especially gifted in both magic and intelligence, having been born into the Empire, which is definitely not a hybrid of Imperial and Nazi Germany. She is naturally set on the path to becoming a mage, this universe's equivalent of fighter aces, magic users who fly through the sky, dogfighting other mages and raining hell on ground forces. The twist to this story is that Tanya is actually a reincarnated Japanese corporate finance manager, an arch-capitalist who is ruthless in his pursuit of the easy life and has no qualms about who he has to crush in his efforts to get one. When he gets murdered by one of the people he fires, he is captured by God, or as Tanya calls him, Being X, who says that his atheist lifestyle and lack of compassion make him a monster, and determines that his punishment should be reincarnation into a world so dark and so desperate that he will be forced to acknowledge Being X's God and turn to good. Tanya scoffs at this, and as such goes forth into the new world with a furious desire to ascend to the top, if only for the fact that she can laze around safe and secure once she reaches it. What the show does is very similar to Paul Verhoeven's film Starship Troopers and its critique of fascism, in the sense that it's a cheesy film a fascist society would make about itself, thereby being a parody of fascism. Because the show is portrayed from Tanya's perspective, it's though we're supposed to sympathize with her. But from the title and the content, it is obvious that this is the exact opposite of what the author intends. Tanya is evil, very evil. She commits war crimes, murders civilians, executes POWs. The empire she serves is analogous to Imperial Germany, but from the constant glory to the empire saluting that they do, and the hyper-militaristic nature of what few glimpses of society we get, it's pretty obvious that while the author states he specifically chose not to include the Nazi-style content because he hates Nazis and feels that it would weigh down the show with baggage, it does allude to a fascist society. What the show demonstrates in my mind is just how easy it is for our guard to slip, and how easy it is for the corporate overlords to transition from your standard capitalists to outright fascists, given the right conditions. It happened in Japan before. The Zaibatsu, quite consciously, began pushing nationalist propaganda and shifting their manufacturing from standard household goods and export items to weapons, warships, and combat aircraft. Mitsubishi especially made a fortune during the war and maintains a stronghold on the automotive market to this day. And this is not unique to Japan either. The company which made Zyklon B gas for the death camps in Germany is now one of America's largest pesticide manufacturers, Dagesh Industries. That's right, one of America's largest pesticide manufacturers is so rich today because it fed the Nazi death camps with chemicals. Have fun with that. War to Tanya is just a means to an end. While she says herself that she feels war is a waste of time and resources, it's exactly that. It's just a material concern. The lives of the people she kills or those killed under her command are of no concern to her. It barely even registers. People, the military, the government, none of it matters. Human beings are numbers, resources, and as such are expendable. All of them exist to serve her needs in pursuit of a comfortable life, and the only ideological position she has at all is her passionate hatred of communists. Because after all, equality and even distribution of resources among workers requires the prerequisite of working, which is everything she wants to avoid. She needs an easy life. She wants an easy life. And people beneath her to do her bidding, all the while being a convenient punching bag. This show stands as an example and warning of where unrestricted capitalism and poor working conditions leads, and how easy it is for the same people loudly proclaiming libertarianism, entrepreneurship, and individual freedom. How easy it is for them to turn into mass-murdering fascists, as long as it serves their own selfish interests. And this mindset usually comes in very early on. Japan's education system is almost Darwinian in its nature. Its standards are incredibly high, and its focus on conformity is downright dystopian if I'm being honest. As I said in the establishing paragraph, student suicide due to bullying, performance pressure, and the ever-increasing alienation experienced by Japanese youth is on the rise. And the first show that we are going to talk about is the open critique of Japan's approach to teaching via a very unique and absurd premise: Assassination Classroom. Ass Class, as it's known amongst the enlightened and the educated, tackles the dichotomy between the standardized arbitrary learning and a more rounded, holistic approach to education. The mechanical system is put in place by the school principal, and it is designed to maximize academic performance through strict adherence to the curriculum. And they are motivated by having an underclass, a subclass which they can mock but simultaneously fear ending up in, E-class. Essentially, fear of failure and being treated as a loser, outcast or substandard, is what motivates the students of this school. And the education they receive is one of programming, under the pretext that they are being armed for the ruthless and uncompromising world that awaits them outside of school. This stands in direct opposition to the teaching style of E-class's teacher, Koro-sensei, a tentacle alien who will blow up the Earth next year. That's an inspiring start. His students are given a simple task: assassinate the monster and save the Earth. Whoever achieves this will be compensated handsomely. Koro-sensei himself is the orchestrator of this class dynamic because of his experiences, and more so because it allows him to show the students a different way of learning things. This show makes a resounding case that the bland and dull teach and test system of education is flawed, that the arbitrary method of examination, while effective in gauging proficiency, does nothing to actually educate students in how to live and work better in society. It simply gives them a piece of paper qualifying them for a similarly run college or some position in business. Koro-sensei's approach to education is to give the students a deadly weapon: the ability to utilize their own personal strength, to embrace their own unique way of thinking and working. He doesn't program his students, he educates them, and by doing so, their mental agility causes them to surpass all other students in the school. They can think for themselves, form ideas and arguments, and when it comes to study, they take a far more information in, while simultaneously being able to practically apply it. Far from being weak in the face of rigorous standards and expectations, E-class's non-conformity and independent thinking makes them stronger than anyone else. It is a firm rebuke of the current system of education, not just in Japan, but throughout the world, and strikes at the very heart of Japan's hierarchical structure, stating that with clarity of purpose, only minds free of preconceptions and rigid structure can truly thrive. But what about the social aspect of school and adolescence? Well, that's where Bunny Girl Senpai comes in. We are all familiar by now with the greatest bait and switch in light novel history, but the show's angle on social situations and how society in Japan works is quite enlightening. Sakuta is a man much like my main man Kion, in the sense that he absolutely does not give a fuck about society. And I agree with him. But unfortunately in Japan, it's made apparent that society gives a fuck about you, even if it's to shit on you constantly. Sakuta is an outcast, and people either avoid him or openly mock him because of it. Japanese social settings and pressures carry an air of guilt by association. This is extremely damaging for LGBT people, as well as the standard loners or weirdos, of which Sakuta is the latter. It's brought up initially by the side-eye stares Sakuta gets from his best friend's girlfriend, demanding he stop hanging around as it will make her boyfriend and by extension her unpopular. And this theme of social alienation continues right throughout the show. Mai Sakurajima, meanwhile, is herself being slowly alienated from society by the fact that her once ubiquitous fame has now ended. And despite her wishes for anonymity initially, this isolation, which is exacerbated by the supernatural puberty syndrome, leads her to have massive self-confidence issues and a sense of irrelevance. And this goes on through the cast, such as Futaba's alienation and cries for attention, Kaida's backstory and how she was ruthlessly bullied, to Koga hiding her country girl accent in order to be trendier so she'll fit in. It's a mirror on the alienating society which adolescents in Japan face, and how one's social status and appearance to others is often perceived as more important than your own self-fulfillment and well-being. And this comes to a head in the issues regarding bullying and the corresponding rise in youth suicide in Japan, tackled by the beautiful Koe no Kotachi, a silent voice. The social hierarchy and constant pressure to perform while simultaneously being able to excel and stand out seems contradictory, but it is precisely what is expected. Silent Voice's portrayal of bullying is harrowing. As the victim of constant bullying when I was younger, I seriously wanted to reach into the screen and strangle the protagonist. I genuinely despised him and his treatment of Shoko, and it forced me to pause the film several times so I could calm my seething rage so I could continue watching. I understand that this was the intent of the film, and as such I can only sing this film's praises till the day I die, but it was difficult to watch. One scene which appears in the manga has a distressingly young Shoko signing in despair, "I want to die." Shoko's disability leaves her unable to fully conform to society around her, and as such it makes her a target for ridicule. And Shoya uses her to advance his own popularity, only for him to go too far. And there is another subtle comment on Japan's social structures. People are only too happy to look the other way, or even enjoy the misery of others, but it's different entirely when this behavior reflects poorly on the group. Shoya's struggle with social anxiety, his ability to look people in the eye, his constant self-loathing in his former actions, and his contemplation of suicide in order to atone and apologize for his sins. Shoko, meanwhile, wants to end her life, not necessarily because of her own suffering, but because rather she feels her existence is burdening others. Her disability is holding back her mother, her sister. Her people make fun of her, so she can't fit in. And now Shoya, who is trying so hard to make up for how he treated her, is suffering emotionally and socially, seemingly because of her. She thinks maybe it will be better off if I'm not around. Combine these societal pressures and the collective mentality, and you see the roots of Japan's suicide epidemic. Forcing people out who don't belong. Convincing people that they are worthless or otherwise defective, or shaming people to the extent that they just can't cope. All the while subjecting them to an education system which piles on the stress, pushing people far beyond their limits, with little regard for their safety or their sanity. Mental illness is still stigmatized in most Western nations, and in Japan it's doubly so. In fact, anyone with some form of disability in Japan suffers greatly from isolation and stigmatization. And the brutal way which A Silent Voice shows this dark side of society is chilling, yet somehow beautiful. In any case, this film strikes at the core of how the youth of Japan develop, and its corresponding popularity seems to have struck a chord, both in Japan and abroad. And rightfully so. And now the big one, feminism in anime. Now it would be fair to say that the majority of the anime fandom are men, and as such, the less intellectual content tends to reflect this, but there has been a seismic shift in recent years, and the ever-increasing amount of women, both as fans and as creators, has seen things change radically. And no one represents that better than Mari Okuda. She has had a direct hand in many a masterpiece, most notably Anohana. She also did a fun little show called Go Sick, lowly Sherlock Holmes in 1930s Europe. Fun times. But what's really important, and something that many Western audiences don't appreciate as much as they should, is in fact her first pure original, and in my opinion, her most important work, O Maidens in Their Savage Season. This show is amazing. Izumi and Amagi are genuinely so relatable it's ridiculous. They are the most accurate depiction of high school boys I've seen in media in general. But they aren't important. In fact, they are the worst part of the show, because O Maidens in Their Savage Season is about young girls coming to terms with the fact that there is a thing called lust, and an activity called sex, and that they are right in the middle of when all of those feelings come into being. And so the object of all of their problems, the cause of their emotional and hormonal instability, is those stupid fucking testosterone-fueled assholes over there who, for some reason, which they have no concept of, they can't stop thinking about. Except for Momoko, who doesn't think about these guys because she is, what we call in the community, the big gay. And with girls around her like this, who can blame her? I can't. I don't think people appreciate in the West just how important this show is, both in its content and its cultural context. While we've had shows explore the topic before, it's never been a big name or big budget enterprise, and it has never been the exclusive focus of the show. If you had approached an anime studio 10 years ago, or maybe even 5 years ago with this idea, they would have told you, no way in hell. Unless you're watching an ecchi wish fulfillment show or a straight up hentai, there is generally only one characterization of female sexuality in anime. That being hyper prudish, embarrassed, flustered women and girls who smack or run away from the filthy perverted boys. The idea that women would have their own complex and deep emotions, their own sexual and personal identities, and most of all, genuine sexual desire portrayed not as the gratification of male fantasy, but as a genuine motivator of their thoughts and actions. Women in charge of, or in many cases, barely hanging on to their own sexual destiny. A story written by a woman, about young women, and how they handle a subject that Japan flat out refuses to talk about. Promiscuity is frowned upon in Japan, generally speaking, but among women especially. A woman's sexuality is often not discussed at all, or if it is a passing mention or a firm example of bad behavior. Women's sexualization in anime is perfectly fine if we're talking ecchi and hentai. After all, that's what these shows are for. Just as long as the girls get some hot guys to look at too, such as in Food Wars or Free. But the hypersexualization of women has spread out to almost every single show. Even serious shows have a certain amount of fan service when it comes to its female characters, and to me it's indicative of just how sexuality is viewed in Japan. In essence, it's entirely a man's world. So when O Maidens in Their Savage Season comes into the spotlight, it is the biggest breath of fresh air we have needed in a very long time. The cheesy high school tropes fall away, and what we have is a genuine depiction of the messy world of teenage relationships, school drama, club activities, hanging out after class. It's also a show that I feel every teenager should watch. As a teenage guy, this would have been invaluable to try and understand those weirdly curvy life forms over there who, while they spoke the same language as me, seem to communicate in a completely different way. And likewise, Amagi and Izumi's depictions and how they act or think should give young women a very accurate glimpse into the minds of us idiots who are just trying to play it cool, while we're literally only barely keeping our shit together. But for women in Japan, life gets much tougher out of school. Once into the world, they have a choice of pursuing a career or finding a man to marry. Now this is a struggle women have had world over and have fought against for centuries, but in Japan it's especially poignant. And the two examples I'd pick for this are, as mentioned before, Agretsuko and Kobayashi's Dragon Maid. Agretsuko is a comedy and shows the struggles of Retsuko trying to make her way in the professional world. The overbearing and unreasonable expectations of her employer in a male-dominated workforce. The constant social pressures and questions of romantic pursuit when she is just trying to make it. In fact, one of the core jokes of the series is that she's trying to get married just so she can get out of the professional world. It is taking the light-hearted route and is, quite honestly, gut-bustingly hilarious. But Retsuko's struggles are not unusual for young women, and it's calling to attention this issue in a genius way. The expectation that women should just quit the workforce after marriage is dying in the West. Unfortunately, while I think feminism has had an impact, I think it's primarily because the economic conditions are deteriorating to the extent that both women and men have to work in order to avoid poverty, and even then that's not always a guarantee. But the traditionalist culture in Japan persists. And while more women than ever are joining the workforce and attaining high political and economic positions, for most women they still face some form of discrimination in the workplace. In fact, they face some of the highest discrimination, as well as corresponding levels of sexual violence, many of such crimes not even being reported due to the women either feeling fear or more insidiously, feeling that it's normal. O Maidens touched on this very topic quite brutally, and about fucking time that somebody actually did. Kyoto Animation, meanwhile, shows this in a more subtle way. At work, the titular Kobayashi is one of, if not the most important employee in her workplace, with considerable experience and talent in her job role, but she is constantly berated by her manager for not performing up to the standard, despite putting in more hours and getting more done, while simultaneously supporting and in many cases leading or even carrying the team. All of the employees in the workplace observe this and remark on how much shit the manager gives her. However, while they take note that Kobayashi is in general superior to the manager and would probably do a better job, no one rushes to her defense, except of course her stealth magic wielding dragon maid, Toru. But what stands out more than anything, and this is KyoAni's masterful subtlety at work, as Toru walks through the office and surveys the desks, what do you see? What stands out at this scene? You probably don't notice it, but I reckon it's very intentional. All of the people at these desks, all of them are men. Every single one. Kobayashi is the only woman in this workplace, and the only focus for her manager's ire. Now you can say this is coincidence, but I honestly believe that they are making a point. KyoAni, as mentioned before, has made a point of hiring women into their studio, and as a result their female characters often feel much more real and alive. But these women bring their own experiences into their work, and unfortunately, while women all over the world, generally speaking, have a higher propensity for art, their involvement in the anime and mainstream art industry in Japan is severely limited. And if they have worked for other studios, I can guarantee this depiction of discrimination occurred. The fact that more and more content aimed at female audience, written and animated by women, is a godsend, and is slowly but surely forming a wave of new and wonderful romance anime, such as Bloom Into You by Neo Nakatani, among others, as well as bringing more depth to the heroines in the action and comedy genres that we already love so much. Now there's a reason I brought up Bloom Into You alongside Kobayashi's Dragon Maid, and that is to point out something else. And that is of course the ever-increasing focus being brought onto LGBT issues in Japan. Despite progress being made, the LGBT community in Japan is still yet to achieve equality with the other developed nations of the world. And yet most Japanese in modern day, below the age of 50, support gay marriage. In fact, they openly support it. Like in the United States and the Anglosphere in general, the conservative and religious movements have a strong hold in government, and despite progressive reforms that have taken place over the past few years, no federal laws in Japan are in place to protect LGBT people from discrimination or any motions to legalize same-sex marriage. The Tokyo prefectures, however, did put in anti-discrimination laws and anti-hate crime laws in place for their areas of control after much pressure from activist groups. One of the largest being, of all people, the Japanese Communist Party. However, in the anime and manga sphere, as well as film and literature, the representation and advocacy for LGBT issues has skyrocketed. Pedantic Romantic has made a great video about the gay dragons, which you should check out if you haven't already. But suffice to say, Toru and Kobayashi's relationship, while inferred, really is an open statement about being gay in Japan, and more controversially, same-sex parenting. But I want to talk about one scene in particular, and that is when Toru takes down a thief in the marketplace, only to realize that she may have accidentally outed herself as a dragon and be set upon by the humans around her. She is terrified that all that she's worked for will be torn away from her. Everyone around her seems to be closing in, and she's terrified. Everything will be taken away if people find out what she is. Come on, KyoAni. You aren't fooling anyone here. I have spent a lot of time around the gay community, and some of my closest friends online, such as the TK Jones from the Eastern Marshlands podcast, are openly gay and proud of it. Among young people in the West, for the most part, being openly gay is not an issue. In fact, it barely raises comment. Being introduced to two guys holding hands is not strange, or a man acting openly gay. Being a queen, to use the old school slang. It's just something that is. It's normal. But in Japan, it can still destroy careers, ruin social standing, and by extension is, again, a contributing factor to teenage suicide. Kobayashi's Dragon Maid and its open depiction of a homosexual family, Bloom Into You and O Maidens in their Savage Season, dealing with the discovery of these feelings that society tells you that you shouldn't have, and directly challenging that fact. The best example of this would be Momaka in O Maidens in her Savage Season, when she poses the question to Kazusa, if you had to do it with someone, or the world would blow up, who would you choose? Me, your best friend, or our teacher Yamagashi? Kazusa thinks about this and replies, I love you dearly, Momoko, you know I do. But you're a girl, so I'd have to go with our sensei. Mari Okuda is throwing a reality at us here. The girls can't conceptualize it. Kazusa doesn't say, I'm not gay, so I'd have to pick our teacher. She just states categorically that because Momoko is a girl, despite her feelings and closeness obviously being higher to her, she would do it with a guy she barely knows instead, because that's how things are. That's how things are expected to be. Momoko, meanwhile, realizes that she doesn't want the guys. No. She desperately wants to sleep with the girls instead. And that realization, far from being a joyous and liberating feeling, feels like a prison to her, and scares her shitless. The fact that more and more of Japanese popular media is tackling these issues is a signifier of change, and a change for the better. LGBT representation and the addressing of their struggles is something that needs to be seen. The stigmatization of their sexuality needs to end, and the youth of Japan, once again, are leading the charge. But noticeably, there is one particular part of this that has only very recently come to the fore as more than just a common trope, but is being taken seriously, that being transgender characters. Now, traps, as they have been called in the past, are common in anime, mainly due to the fetish aspect. But I want to single out one particular example in this case, that being Ruka from Steins Gate. Now, while her introduction is played off as a cheap trap gag, and admittedly, despite its poor taste, is pretty fucking hilarious, Rukako becomes more and more developed, and as we see her identity in flux between her true female form and her transgender form, Steins Gate does something very remarkable, especially considering that this was made almost a decade ago. Ruka's identity between the two positions, biological female and transgender, does not change in the slightest beyond society's expectations. Ruka is still Ruka in each timeline. The distinct separation of her identity and personality from her physical body, and how the perception of each reflects her status in society. This is groundbreaking for a show to address. When Ruka clings to Okabe before he reverses time to return Ruka to her transgender life, she cries out in agony, I love you, Okabe. I don't want you to go. I don't want to go back there, because no one will understand. No one will accept how I feel about you. It never fails to tear my heart out every time I watch it. But Okabe's continued use of the feminine version of Ruka's name, that being Rukako, is a testament to how ahead of its time Steins Gate was, and in many ways still is. But here we are. We are finally at the point where we've addressed all the issues I've raised, and I hope that I've given you an idea of the cultural revolution that is currently sweeping through Japan in the anime world. The question is, now, where does it go from here? Where does this transformation go? Well, I'll tell you where. Because there is one show in recent memory which summarizes everything that has transpired. A show that symbolizes the shift that has taken place and proudly proclaims that times are a-changing. And what's genuinely amazing about this is the fact that the most progressive and transformative show to come out of the anime industry in recent years comes from what is historically the most exploitative, objectifying, and commodifying genre of all. An idol show. In fact, the best idol show I have ever seen, and one that has garnered not just the love of idol trash fandom, which I am shamefully a member of, but of mainstream anime fandom in general. Zombieland Saga is a show that came literally out of fucking nowhere, and it took our medium by storm. And it is everything that has been building up over the years to turn it into the masterpiece that it is. Now, I have been meaning to do a full video on Zombieland Saga, but to put it in simple terms, every concept in this show tackles a particular element of either the entertainment industry or society at large, and it does so with the most genius device I've seen in recent years. That being that all the idols are from different eras of history. Junko comes from the 60s through 80s era of idols and has a very outdated view, an almost aristocratic persona, and she feels distant from both her fellow performers and her fans. She is emblematic of the conservative and restrictive society she grew up and worked in. Her flaws and inability to adapt, as well as her antisocial behaviors, strike directly at the elitist hierarchical mentality that has permeated Japanese society, which is brought up wonderfully in her confrontation with Ai, the lead singer of Iron Frill. Ai comes from the 2000s era of connectivity. She is from the younger generation and has disregard for what is considered proper or the done thing. She talks directly to her fans, she socializes openly, she works hard and is independent for the most part. Ai is everything that both the contemporary and especially the older culture of Japan is afraid of, and this clash of conservatism and progressivism is a constant source of contention. While talking about Ai, however, the show also talks about post-traumatic stress disorder and how the mental hang-ups caused by mental illness are not some silly fear or character defect, but a genuinely debilitating issue, and almost always is no fault of the sufferer. Her death was a direct result of being struck by lightning, and she has since had a crippling fear of thunder. Her confrontation of this fear and her ability to push through is not just a testament to herself, but a message that it is our friends and colleagues who often get us through. Stigmatization and mockery are replaced by understanding and solidarity, giving people the strength to push through. And it doesn't stop there. Consider the cast as a whole for a second. It's comprised of 2 professional women who are outstanding in both their talent and expertise, having earned their position through hard work. A mentally deficient girl who is only basically aware, but has more heart than anyone else. A young woman who works harder than anyone only to be undone by her kindness. A trans girl who has to confront society's ignorance and her own dysphoria at a very young age. A sex worker who is also highly educated and full of wisdom that only comes from years of experience, all of whom are being led by a delinquent biker chick who is incredibly independent, says shit like it is, does not take shit from anyone, hates the class system, and hates the idea that someone can't be something or do something. Not to mention that she makes a habit of trying to take over the country's streets and fight police officers. All these characters are a shot across the bow of every major social ill currently facing Japan, and in fact I think it's a genius move that these girls are zombies. When they are in makeup they are all stunning and wonderful, but for the most part they avoid sexualization because that would be fucking weird. It's genius. Comedic and writing genius. Unless you're talking about Yugiri, because my god, the Ara Ara game is just nuts. Being a courtesan though, this is to be expected as she is a high-class prostitute. But think of it, one of the most important characters who is a source of wisdom and leadership is a sex worker. This is a mainstream anime we're talking about here, and prostitution is illegal in Japan. That's huge. Lily, meanwhile, according to my trans friends, is the most accurate portrayal of gender dysphoria in media they have seen. And this show screams trans rights to the heaven. To quote Saki, "Who cares what kind of junk she's got?" A typical answer from our resident anarchist biker chick. The horrible conditions of students in Japan, the exploitative nature of the entertainment industry, the class divide and hyperconservatism of society, the plight of LGBT people in such a society, the struggles of neurodivergent or the mentally ill, combined with the message of collective solidarity, friendship and hard work. Not for the nameless corporations, but for each other and ourselves. Zombieland Saga hits every single note it seeks to hit, and that it's only fitting, considering the idols themselves have an absolutely banging musical style, ranging from metal to big band jazz. Zombieland Saga, more than anything else in recent times, stands apart as a symbol of building a more accepting, tolerant and beautiful world, a harmony of the traditional with the progress of the youth. With the modern world the way it is, there is one constant question among the people of the world. What of the future? The youth of the world, notably us millennials, are finally entering our slide into the middle age. The core values of our generation are going to quickly become the norm, and thus society will begin a radical change. And nowhere will change be more radical than in Japan. Political engagement in Japan is some of the lowest among democratic countries. The apathy felt by the Japanese people and the simple acceptance of the status quo. But this is beginning to change, and the artists of Japan are heralding the start of a cultural revolution which many would have said impossible. It is the youth of Japan that are beginning to ask the hard questions. It is the youth who are confronted with this world that are beginning to stand up and take notice of what has happened in their country, and where, if it left unchecked, it will lead. And they are beginning to take a stand. Now, I know many people will say that as I am not Japanese, it's not my place to comment or tell them where they should go or what they should believe, and I wholeheartedly agree. But I can say with all the passion and conviction I have, with all the love I have for their culture that spans millennia, their history that tells tales of great heroism and drama as well as horrific evil, and of course their art, which has formed the basis of both my entertainment and, with this YouTube channel, my own creative inspiration. I can say that Japan is changing for the better, and its youth are leading the charge. The land of the rising sun is ancient, it is beautiful, and it has many accomplishments. but it has yet to reach its zenith. At the end of the film Shin Godzilla, the chief political advisor says, "This country rose from the ashes through scrap and build, and it will do so again." After the Fukushima meltdown, the ever-growing climate crisis, the economic collapse that looms on the horizon, and the social conservatism that plagues their nation, the Japanese people are beginning to fight. Not only for what is right and just, but for each other. Because while I said that their one overriding social stigma is know your place, their overwhelming cultural strength is come together. Beneath all the flaws that their country has, all of our homes have flaws. Let's be honest, most of us watching this are Americans. Think about that. For all the failings that their country has had over the centuries, the Japanese people are kind, they are sensitive, and they are brimming with emotion and passion, sharing this love of the world with us through their artistic expression. And while their culture and values may be changing, of one thing you can be certain: their love of life will never die. Thanks for watching, everyone. If you've reached the end of this video, I hope you've liked it. Leave a like and click subscribe. Massive shout out to Shonen Ronin, especially Calliope from Shonen Ronin, who helped edit this video and contributed most of the info. Also, big shout outs to some of the Japanese people I spoke to help make this video. This has been Posada's Pac-Man. Less hardcore content coming soon. I'll see you next time.